Have you ever wished you had a new way to look at the world? A lens that could help you make sense of all the complex decisions that people, companies, and governments make every single day? Well, that's exactly what economics is all about. And it's not just about money and charts, not at all. It's a really powerful way of thinking. So let's pull back the curtain and learn how to think like an economist. I just love this cartoon because it nails it. It gets right to the heart of what we're talking about. At its core, economics is a social science. It's really the study of people, how we make choices, how we interact with each other, and how we grapple with the fact that we just can't have everything we want. It's all about understanding human behavior. And, just like any other field, whether it's medicine or computer science, economics has its own language. You're going to hear terms like supply and demand, opportunity cost, and elasticity. Now, they might sound like a bunch of jargon at first, but trust me, they're the building blocks of a whole new framework that will help you see the world with some pretty incredible clarity. To really get this new way of thinking, we've got to understand the two main hats an economist wears. First up, we have the economist as a scientist. In this role, their job is to be totally objective, to simply explain how the world works, kind of like how a biologist explains how cells divide. So how do they do that? Well, they use the scientific method. It's this constant dance between theory and observation. An economist might see prices going up, right? So they develop a theory about why. Let's say they think the government is printing too much money. Then they go out and collect a ton of data, maybe from dozens of countries, to see if that theory actually holds water. Yeah, that brings up a really good question. A chemist can just go into a lab and mix a couple of chemicals together, but an economist can't exactly go and, say, double a country's money supply just for fun to see what happens, right? That would be, it would be total chaos. So if they can't run controlled experiments, how do they test their theories? Well, they turn to history. History gives us what we call natural experiments. So for example, when a war in the Middle East disrupts oil supplies, that's a real-world event. It gives economists a massive amount of data on how economies react when a key resource suddenly becomes scarce. These moments in history are just invaluable for testing economic ideas. Now, the world is an incredibly complex place, so to make sense of it, economists have to make assumptions. And it's really an art form. Think about it like this. If a physicist wants to calculate how fast a marble falls, it's pretty safe to assume there's no air friction. It works great. But try to make that same assumption for a beach ball, you're going to get a completely wrong answer. The key is knowing which simplifying assumption to make for the question you're trying to answer. And those assumptions are the bedrock of what we call economic models. A model is really just a simplified version of reality. The plastic model of the human body you see in a biology class? It doesn't show every single cell, but it's super useful for showing how all the major organs fit together. Well, economic models do the exact same thing for the economy, usually with some diagrams and equations. Okay, so let's check out our very first model. This graph here is called a Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF for short. It's simple, but it's really powerful. So imagine an economy that only makes two things, cars and computers. This curved line shows every possible combination of cars and computers that this economy can possibly produce if it's using all its resources as efficiently as possible. And this one simple curve shows us some of the biggest ideas in economics. You see any point outside the curve? That's impossible to reach. That's scarcity. You can't have everything. Any point on the curve? That's efficiency. It means the economy is getting the absolute most from what it has. And finally, opportunity cost. To get more cars, you have to move along the curve and give up some computers. It's a perfect picture of that old saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. But here's the thing. These models aren't static. What if there's a huge breakthrough, like a new computer chip that makes manufacturing way more efficient? Well, boom. The entire frontier shifts outward. Suddenly, the economy can produce more computers and more cars than it ever could before. This is literally what economic growth looks like on a graph. Okay, so that was the economist wearing the scientist hat, explaining the world as it is. But economists also play a second, very different role. And that's the role of a policy advisor, where they actually try to help improve the world and suggest how things ought to be. And this brings us to a really, really important distinction. Look at the statement on the left. Minimum wage laws cause unemployment. That's a positive statement. It's a claim about how the world works, and we can test it with data. Now look at the right. The government should raise the minimum wage. That's a normative statement. It's a prescription, a claim based on someone's values. You can't prove or disprove it with data alone. So whenever you hear an economist speak, you have to ask yourself, are they wearing their scientist hat or their policy advisor hat? And of course, in the real world, it's not like a president or a prime minister is only listening to their economists. They're also hearing from communications advisors, political strategists, all sorts of people. Making policy is a messy, complicated recipe, and the economist's advice is just one of the key ingredients. So this leads us to something you've probably heard a million times, a common complaint, right? If economics is supposed to be a science, why on earth can't economists ever agree on anything? I mean, George Bernard Shaw nailed this feeling perfectly with that quote. There are tons of jokes about this. President Reagan used to joke that if Trivial Pursuit were made for economists, it would have 100 questions and 3,000 answers. So yeah, this idea that they're always arguing is a really popular stereotype. But here's the thing. Is it actually true? Is there really that much disagreement among the experts? Well, let's take a look at the actual evidence. Take a look at this number, 93%. What do you think that represents? Well, that's the percentage of economists in a survey who agree that putting a ceiling on rents reduces the quantity and quality of housing. That is an absolutely overwhelming consensus. And that's not just a one-off. Look at this table. There is massive agreement across a whole range of really important issues, from free trade to budget deficits. 93% agree that tariffs are bad for the economy. 85% agree we should get rid of agricultural subsidies. It turns out the perception of disagreement is way, way bigger than the reality. So when we do see real disagreement, it usually boils down to one of two reasons. First, they might have different scientific judgments. They might disagree about a specific theory or how big a particular effect is. That's a debate about the data. And second, they just have different values. Just like the rest of us, economists can have different views about what's more important, a super efficient outcome or a more fair and equitable. This quote from the famous economist John Maynard Keynes just ties this all together so perfectly. He said that a great economist needs to be a little bit of everything: a mathematician, a historian, a philosopher. They have to be comfortable with abstract models, but also be able to explain things in plain language. It just highlights this beautiful blend of hard science and a much broader understanding of the world. So, what's the bottom line here? Learning to think like an economist is so much more than memorizing terms for a test. It's about learning a disciplined, objective way to look at the world. It trains your brain to see the hidden trade-offs and, this is so important, to anticipate the unintended consequences that can pop up from any decision or policy. This way of thinking is a seriously powerful new lens. So I'll leave you with this question. Now that you have this toolkit, what unseen trade-offs are you going to start noticing all around you? In your own life, in the news, in the politics you hear about every single day? Because I can promise you, once you start thinking like an economist, you'll start seeing them everywhere.